It goes into just here we are today, where 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read is controlled by 6 corporations, 6 giant umbrella corporations. How does this function? You've called it a cartel because it seems like every single outlet echoes the exact same narrative and pro-U.S. bias.
Yes, that's right. You know, for a long time I used to think that what's happened to the media is entirely a matter of, runaway deregulation, too much concentration of power, too few independent voices, too little broadcast regulation, and so on. And I think that has a great deal to do with it. But I now realize that there's another factor that has to be considered as well, and that is the energetic involvement of the covert side of our own government in the news and entertainment business. Countless people within the media are either wittingly involved with, our intelligence agencies, which is something that started to be exposed in the 70s with the congressional hearings, not just the CIA, but the FBI as well.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
But then there are also a lot of people who are, manipulated in traditional ways. They have sources inside the government who will give them certain tips, give them certain stories, and they end up becoming dependent on those sources for that kind of information. They break really big stories and so on, and then they, I think without even knowing it, end up carrying water for those agencies. You can hire people, you can actually pay them, you can have them under contract, right? Which is chilling and wrong in a democracy for the government to be paying people who are supposed to be providing the public with news to, basically insert state propaganda into that news. It's wrong, but it's only one way of many in which the press and often the entertainment industries end up reflecting, serving the agenda of the state and very, very powerful corporations. How else to explain the bizarre unanimity that we notice today of the press on certain stories that they somehow managed to get absolutely wrong over and over and over and over? I mean, I've been around for a long time, studying the media in this country for decades. I've really never seen anything like this. There's an Alice in Wonderland quality to it, because we live in a country that prides itself on freedom of expression and the marketplace of ideas. And yet we see over and over and over and over again on issue after issue, there's a certain truth that is enforced with exactly the same kind of ruthlessness and impatience with any disagreement that you'll find in countries like North Korea.
It's not like it's some big conspiracy theory where there's just 100 guys in a room smoking, figuring out, here, we're going to pull this on this news agency, Fox is going to air this. The interlocking boards of directorates, the sponsorship, the direct-to-consumer advertising, especially when it comes to pharmaceutical agencies. How would you say it works? Is it just a machine functioning on its own and people are self-censoring and they just know they can't touch certain subjects?
Sometimes it happens, at the moment because of a particular interest exerting pressure. A lot of times it happens in this way, that a particular interest is vigilant in its own defense, is on the lookout for any kind of coverage that's going to screw with their bottom line, and then this has been going on for 100 years, okay? But, you raised a really important point, the end of your question, about self-censorship, right? And you used the phrase conspiracy theory a moment ago, and I think it's important that we talk about that because that will help us understand exactly how this works, conspiracy theory. People like me, people like you, are often, dismissed, ridiculed, derided as conspiracy theorists. And this has become especially urgent and kind of vehement recently, where David Cameron of Britain actually said twice that conspiracy theorists are as dangerous as ISIS.
We must be clear. To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism.
And after the Charlie Hebdo thing, Francois Hollande came out and said they were actually going to come up with legislation to make conspiracy theory illegal, okay? His notion of conspiracy theory was a weird jumble of, anti-Semitic fantasies and, 9/11 truth and people questioning vaccines and, fans of Putin, fans of Chavez. It was a kind of grab bag of forbidden topics, you know what I mean? But actually, to make it illegal, right? Conspiracy theory illegal? Well, when we hear this kind of hysterical attack on what they call conspiracy theory, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is that? Where did that come from? What do they mean? And having been myself kind of marginalized as a conspiracy theorist right after I came out with my book on election fraud, Fooled Again, 2005, I became very interested in this question. Since when are we worried about something called conspiracy theory? Well, the answer to the question is that the notion of conspiracy theory, that meme was pretty much non-existent in American journalism until the late 60s. If you go back and look into the archives of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and you type in conspiracy theory, you'll find very few examples. And the examples you will find are very inconsistent. The phrase is used in many different ways. Starting in 1967, there's a change. And this has everything to do with the fact that it was in the spring of 1967 that the CIA sent a memo out to all station chiefs worldwide, alerting them to the fact that there had just been published a number of books attacking the Warren Commission report. The memo defends the Warren Commission report and urges the station chiefs for the CIA all over the world to use their propaganda assets and friends in the media to discredit the work of these authors wherever possible. From that moment on, we find conspiracy theory popping up more and more often, used over and over and over and over again, and always in the same way, okay? It's always used, or almost always used, to attack people who are raising questions about state crimes, okay? So it's the Kennedy assassination, or the Bobby Kennedy assassination, or the King assassination. It's Iran-Contra, It's election fraud.
I hate the way that the language has been hijacked to the point where you can't even talk about real open conspiracies that are documented. You can talk about a couple conspiring to kill their child. You can't talk about Wall Street conspiring or financial institutions conspiring to rig currency markets, which we know just happened. I mean, these conspiracies are off limits.
That's right.
Let's talk about going back to the media in terms of, it wasn't just that they were complicit in selling the Iraq war. It's every war. It's every issue. Doubling down on U.S. militarism and basically neoliberal doctrine. Every time there's anything going on, there's just this slew of military generals on TV and also in these alt publications and online journals and such. It's just bizarre. It's like, how did that play out?
Yeah, just a few cranks out there in the world of alternative journalism will raise questions about the propriety of having all these generals appear as talking heads to bless the latest military adventure, and they're always on the boards of the big defense contractors. This is how propaganda works, right? It gets worked into the language that we all use. Yeah. Defense. It's not defense, but yeah, absolutely. They're all basically singing from the same sheet music, and this has been increasing, intensifying, tightening up since the 70s, where there was a brief moment of a kind of uncertainty and division, a response to the Vietnam War, which divided the elites, There was a moment when, Watergate, of course, enabled people to take a skeptical view of executive power, and the CIA was under fire to some extent, being investigated by Congress. There was a moment there in the middle of that decade when there was a window kind of cracked open, and that window was quickly slammed shut by the late 70s. And then the so-called Reagan Revolution kind of settled our hash for a very, very long time. But I do think, again, and not just using my own students as an example, but young people generally, the Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy, these disparate rebellions suggest, as inequality becomes more and more egregious and obvious and destructive, as austerity measures become more and more lethal, people are, moving their way towards saying no to things that they hadn't even really thought about just a few years ago.
Bernays, of course, existed at a time where there were multiple empires competing. You mentioned that manufacturing public consent went as back as Napoleon. Now that there's one dominant military hegemon, you talked about how the U.S. has perfected what Bernays started, but what is the relationship today between maintaining empire and the propaganda model?
Well, I think that the propaganda that batters us all is so repetitious and monotone, precisely because it is at the service of a kind of single dominant. Use the word hegemon. I think that's the truth. That's the case. All of our wars or all of our warlike behaviors, as a nation, seem to be devoted to wiping out any kind of opposition to or divergence from the neoliberal program. They've pretty much done away with a lot of the liberationist movements, that were pretty frisky in the 70s and into the 80s. But we do see them going after Venezuela, for example, which is a kind of aftershock from that long struggle against the left. But the attacks on regimes that are not leftist in any real progressive sense, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya or Assad's Syria, are part of this kind of blind push to wipe out all resistance, to create a perfect Pax Americana.